Howdy, all of you delicious people. I'm here today to review The Old Man, Season 1, Episodes 1 and 2. So, with these two episodes, I was kind of unsure about this show at first, but then once we start to get rolling into it, I'm like, oh, okay, so, there is this, surprise here, there is this reveal here, and then all of a sudden it becomes this kind of chase kind of show, and I really started enjoying it, especially with it feeling like there is some John Wick elements, or there's some certain times where you can't trust what you're seeing at some points because maybe this is kind of rolling around in someone's brain, some memory or some kind of play out of things that this isn't going to be what it truly actually is, and so on and so forth. So yeah, I had fun with this show. I really enjoyed it after the first two episodes, and so teeing it up, what is this technically show about? Which is kind of difficult because you have to be vague also in here. The show is currently available on Hulu, so anyone who has a Hulu account can be able to see this show. So, The Old Man. Come to find out, we have Dan Chase, who is to go on and just kind of be living his normal life, to all of a sudden have a burglar come through his home, and so Dan is to shoot this man and then call his daughter and tell his daughter that he can no longer go on and talk to her anymore because he has to disappear. He goes on to, of course, disappear, and there are people that go on and are chasing after him. And so, I'm like, okay, I'm enjoying this. The more that we start to reveal who Dan actually is fairly interesting. And how we go through these two episodes and really talk uh, about connections of people and so on and so forth. There is a moment where honestly I am immediately knowing exactly where this story is going to head as far as Dan's daughter is concerned within this story. I know exactly where that's going already in two episodes. So you could probably reconfirm with me if you feel the same. Even though in episode 2, they go on and reveal what had happened to Dan's daughter, supposedly. So, with that said, I'm going to go on into, because I have to be very vague about this show. Really, so far, I'm really, it's a definite thumbs up review. I would say that this show is a good, if not great show. To me, I'm not into every bit of this show, but I like how it's playing out as we're trying to uncover Dan and uncover the people that are going after him. So, as if this is this feels kind of like the Bourne Identity, or it kind of feels like the Bourne films. So you can probably figure out where I'm going about this. But anyways, I think it's about that time to just go into spoilers about this show, because I'm trying to keep so many things close to the vest. So definitely check this out. It's available on Hulu. It was so interesting, and I know I'm being so vague. So with that said, let's go into spoilers. I hope I'm going to be able to remember all of this because it's 2 hours of content, and plus all that. There is a lot of just these scenes that are that feel I could say them anytime. So that's the big problem of just I don't know exactly when all of this happens, but I'm going to try to get it all out. So without a doubt, I think it's about that time to just go into spoilers. It's about that time. Let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time we get to spoil this episode's. So, with that said, in the very beginning of episode 1, we of course have Dan, who is consistently going and getting up to consistently go to the bathroom. Every couple hours, getting up, having to go to the bathroom, fall back asleep, wake up every couple hours, go to the bathroom. So Dan then goes on to eventually see Abby Chase, who is to have this sink full of water, and we have Dan who's picking Abby up because Abby is going on and saying, like, I need to be sent somewhere. You should probably go on and this isn't fair for me, or this isn't fair for you to have me be here and me not have everything faculty wise like all there. And so Dan is like, no, like, it's fine, like, I'm gonna take care of you, like, you can just stay right here, everything's gonna be fine. So Dan is to have remembered this moment, and this is all just a memory. And so Dan goes right back to bed. And so the next day, we have Dan, of course, getting ready to put his clothes on, getting both of his dogs to go and play outside. We have Dan who's calling Emily, and so Dan is mentioning to Emily about the past and how, of course, he had at some points gone on to not tell her everything because she was a young kid, and so on and so forth. So Dan is to go off to the doctor's to find out that he is to be forced to speak to a Dr. Howard that is different from the doctor that he's used to seeing, because Dr. Howard's mother is to no longer be in practice because she can't handle the workload anymore, and so her son is kind of taking over a little bit. So Dan, of course, is to have wanted to have this certain test be taken, so that way he can see if everything for him is all normal. Like, it's one of those where if Dan asks for it, then he can take it. And it seems that the doctors say that Dan has passed this test with full flying colors. So, and Dan is to also take this pill to try and prevent possibly lose memory loss or some. So Dan is trying to get ahead of the game as far as some certain things that may lead to having issues somewhere down the road, let's just say. So Dan goes on to be with his dogs, and they go everywhere with him, to the point where Dan even goes to the doctors with his dogs, and the doctor's like, okay, your dogs are here, and Dan's like, yeah, they come with me everywhere. Even to the point where he's at the diner and the dogs are there, and they're like, yeah, we only allow like assistant dogs in here, and he's just like, well, okay then. I'm just gonna leave. So Dan goes on to mention that he is going to like switch going to certain specific doctors. And so Dan makes his way back home, and Dan is starting to sense something. He has this odd feeling. So Dan takes this long wire, puts a number of cans together, and then is to have his dogs be downstairs while he's upstairs, because normally his dogs would sleep with him. So the dogs are downstairs, Dan is sleeping away. All of a sudden, Dan is to hear this noise. And so Dan has noticed that the cans aren't shaking or anything like that. So Dan goes downstairs with his gun, and all of a sudden, while Dan is to also have this flashlight on, he then turns on the flashlight to then have one of his dogs, one of his Rottweiler-like dogs, attack this burglar, who is to go down, and with, of course, a dog kind of over this guy's neck. We have Dan, who is to ask this guy who sent him. He says nothing. Dan shoots him and kills him, and then is to plant some gun with the silencer on this guy, and is to pop off a couple of shots, and then he calls the police. So both of these officers go on and are to tell Dan, it's like, well, hey, okay, so this guy was a burglar and he tried to steal something from you. The only thing that they saw was unusual was the fact that this guy had a silencer. It's like, why would this guy have a silencer in the middle of nowhere? But then they chalk it up to just like, well, there was that one guy who tried to rob this one store with an AK-47. That seemed odd too. So Dan is to go on and say that he used to have real estate in some other state, but it seems like he wouldn't have anybody that would go on and try to kill him. This feels very unusual. So they're like, oh, okay, all right. So Dan is to go on and need to figure out another location of where he can eventually live elsewhere until the police are to go on and get rid of this body and do all the stuff that they need to do. And so the police end up keeping Dan's keys, but they're going to tell him that they're going to leave the keys under his mat, so eventually he can come back to this home. So Dan is to decide to pack up all his things, get his dogs, get this car, and immediately just drive away. And he ends up calling his daughter, Emily, and tells her that he's been found and that he's been feeling it for weeks and he needs to disappear. And so Dan is saying that we probably need to cut down on calling one another. Maybe it'll be for a couple days, maybe a week, maybe a month, maybe a month. So Dan is to go on and drive and is to make it to this diner. All of a sudden, we of course Dan, who's getting a phone call from a guy named Harold Harper. So Harold, of course, had worked with Dan in the past, but I'm assuming that Harold may have much more of a connection to Dan than we assume. I'm also thinking that Emily may have much more of a tie to whoever is going after Dan than we assume. Like, I'm assuming that Emily is to possibly be tied with the FBI going after Dan. And that's probably why Dan is probably always going to be one step ahead, possibly. So Harold is to call Dan at this diner, and so Dan is to give money to this woman in this diner. And so Harold is to tell Dan that in his car they had made a transmitter to go on and figure out the phone number for Dan's phone. He doesn't know how they were able to do something like that or have equipment to be able to do something like that, but they could. So Harold is to tell Dan that he, of course, is not going to be the head of this operation, but if Dan is to go on and run away from them, then Harold will have to go on and take over. And so Harold telling Dan that, like, well, hey, like, I'm telling you, like, I'm giving you a heads up, I'm telling you the truth about all this. Like, do you think that I will go on and get any, like, leniency from you, Dan, for giving you a heads up? And Dan is like, no. Like, it's no different. Because eventually Harold will come after him at some point. And plus, they've had a long history together. So Harold is to go on and explain to Dan that he needs to start driving. And at some point there will be a tail behind him. Because, of course, Harold is at this hangar where we have a number of men who are scrambling to get to Dan, and they are going to fly him off to have Dan meet with a prior guy that Dan had been involved with that wants Dan dead. And somehow or another, that guy was able to, via the government, try to squeeze them to find Dan. Because Harold went on to be at home with his grandson, and Harold was with his grandson, and they were playing Legos together. And so Harold was talking to his grandson, and his grandson was talking about, like, yeah, like, I just want to build a house for me and my grandparents and my mother and father. And Harold is like, well, what do you mean? And Harold's grandson is to go on and say, it's like, well, like, Henry is to mention, it's like, well, just in case my parents ever get the opportunity to be brought back to life one day. So Harold ends up going into another room and crying, and all of a sudden Harold's wife has come to the room and is to tell Harold that there, of course, is someone on the phone. And she also tells Harold that, like, well, hey, like, don't you think it's kind of okay if Henry is to see you cry? And Harold says, like, well, honestly, I think there's enough people in this family that have cried in front of Henry. If I go on, if I don't cry in front of him, I think that's just giving him, like, a different variety of people. Like, I don't want to be the one guy that cries in front of him because everyone else has. So let's give the kid a break. So Harold is to accept this phone call to find out that he is to have to go on and be a consultant on this project that had been closed 30 years ago, and they are bringing back to the fold. And so Harold is saying, like, well, wait a minute, like, this file was closed 30 years ago. Why are we talking about it now? And they're like, well, like, sorry, like, you're going to need to be re-involved in this. So Harold is to now be involved in this case as a consultant, giving Dan technically a heads up. And then when Dan walks back into talking with Raymond Waters, Raymond, of course, is to ask Harold, like, hey, like, you went over there to talk to somebody for a long time. Who is it that you talked to? And Harold tells Raymond, like, well, here's the thing. Like, I don't want to come off as a person that is to be effed with. So, like, so don't give me a reason to have a person that is to be not a person to be effed with. So we go on, and so Harold is to mention to Dan when he was over by this phone that more than likely, if Harold was to go on and have seen Dan, he probably would not recognize him. And because it's been so long. And so Harold is telling Dan that, like, these people are going to come after him, and he has two options. Harold Harold tells Dan, it's like, well, you can continue to run, and then I will have to go on and be a part of this, or you can give yourself up and have you go on and be taken out the way that you need to be taken out. And Harold will have to go on and answer for a number of things that had happened in the past. And either way, it's not looking good for either one of them. So Dan is to go on and is to eventually talk to Emily and tell her that there is probably a chance that he may never be able to talk to her again. Because Harold is to mention to Dan that if Harold is to have to take over on this case, he is going to somehow find Dan's daughter and use it against her. And Harold is going to do everything in his power to do everything that he needs to hurt Emily to get to Dan. And so Harold does not want to go that route, and Dan is to give Harold a reason to fear him. So Dan goes on and is to drop this tracker on the road and then continues to drive. And so both of these agents that get out of their car and get the tracker to realize, like, oh my god, we just end up getting shook by a senior citizen. All of a sudden we have this SUV that comes smashing into this FBI agents, and the only one that had gotten out of the car is to try to go on and take down Dan. And we have a lot of back and forth here. We have Dan trying to get this gun out of this agent's hands and firing off the gun so none of the bullets can be used. Most of this is very hand-to-hand. Very small times there is to, or very little there is to be any kind of, so there is basically be no real weapons used. We have a lot of like rear naked choke attempts going on between both Dan choking out this agent and consistently hitting him in the nuts with his feet. Dan is consistently trying to figure out some way to not overpower this guy, but figure out like a way to get to him. But eventually we have this agent who zip ties Dan's arms and legs, puts him in this vehicle, and Dan goes on to eventually put his seatbelt on and then cut his ties and then go after this guy yet again. They end up flipping this car over, and what ends up happening is Dan was to try to sick his dogs on this agent before they were to get into the car together. The dogs end up chasing after this car, and so when Dan is to finally go and have this car flip over, the dogs appear and start attacking this agent while Dan is to get out of this car. And so now Dan is to call whatever phone was to be called previous. And so Dan is now talking to Harold and saying, like, hey, like, if you go on and send anybody after me, like, I'm going to go on and give you bodies. But if you go after my daughter Emily, I'm going to send them back to you in pieces. Do you recognize me now? So, really, that's like the big finisher of this episode. We also had a flashback while Dan was in this diner talking to Abby, how Dan and Abby were going to go on and change who they were to now live here and disappear. And like, so we end up finding out who the woman was in the bathroom, and that was like older Abby. And in the second episode, we end up going on and finding out that maybe Abby had to give up so much for Dan, and maybe somewhere down the road we're going to find out what exactly all of that is within these episodes. So within the second episode, we have Harold, who is to now take over for this FBI investigation. And so Dan is going on to, or Dan, Harold is to be taking over this FBI investigation. And so Harold is to go on and is to re-meet up with certain characters like Angela, who I guess was to be Harold's partner, where he consistently calls her kiddo. Which, it's kind of funny because Dan would also call this Emily, he would call her kiddo. So that's more of the reason why I'm thinking, like, well, like, there has to be some kind of maybe family connection between both Dan and between both Harold. But so Harold is to go on and meet up with Angela, who is in this one conference room with a bunch of people who are all celebrating a guy named Joe's birthday. And so Harold ends up asking, like, well, whose birthday is it? And Joe's like, well, it's mine. And so Harold is mentioning that Joe isn't eating any birthday cake or really doing any celebrating. And Joe's like, well, here's the thing. Like, I don't like birthdays. I don't like birthday cake, but it seems that everyone else likes it. So, like, I'm just here because, like, they like all these things. And so, like, I like being around these people who like all these things. So that's why I'm here. And so Harold's like, oh, okay, well, I appreciate the honesty. So we have Harold that is going to need a minute to get to his desk and plop all this stuff out. And so we have Angela who's talking to Harold and mentioning, it's like, well, hey, why are you here? Like, why aren't you, like, at home, like, with your grandson? And Harold's like, well, no, like, I need to go on and do this case. Like, it's really important. So we also have, when Harold was originally talking to Dan, they had talked about, like, what had happened to one another, how Dan had lost Abby, and Harold had mentioned how he had lost his uh, like he had lost his kid. So within this episode, also we have a young Harold and we have a young Dan who are talking to one another because it seems that Dan had wanted a number of guns, a number of rifles from Harold because Dan is going on and working with this one guy who he thinks is actually going to be their ally and not their enemy, and Harold is going on and telling him something different. It's like, well, like how is it that every single like intel that we have on this guy is telling us that he's our enemy and you're telling us something completely different? How can the whole FBI be wrong and you be right? And we just have Dan who's like, well, because I have a feeling, I have a hunch, and I think I'm right. So Harold doesn't go on and give Dan these rifles, and it's kind of interesting how young Dan was mentioning to Harold how like, man, like you look like you're going on and like you're going golf somewhere, and Harold is like, well, yeah, of course, because I'm not the guy who needs to go on and pretend to be somebody like you are. So like when I'm gonna come here, I'm gonna come as I am. So like that was kind of interesting to kind of see like to have them talk about agents and who people should really be at some points. But so and that was an interesting flashback. So Dan is to now go on and he is to have called someone to set up a house for him that had all the groceries, all the fixings, all of everything, and that Dan may then go on and talk to this guy that he is to have him help disappear with, and Dan is to say it's like, well, or the guy on the phone is to tell Dan it's like, well, it'll be nice to like put a face to a name, and Dan's like, yeah, I've I'll hope to feel that same way. So Dan then goes off to drive to this location where there seems to be a house for rent. And so Dan goes on and is to take this house and then is to find out that there is a woman named Zoe who is to technically be the co-owner of the house that Dan is living in. But Zoe, of course, is to be in the house across the street. And so Zoe is looking on at Dan, who is to come out and talk to her with two dogs. And Zoe's like, I don't know about the whole dog thing because, like, I don't want some dog to tear up this house and this is just a house for rent. And, like, I think that we had a whole, like, thing on this agreement where there were no dogs. And Dan is to say, it's like, well, the dogs are very well trained. And Zoe's like, I don't know about that. So Zoe is to tell Dan, it's like, well, I'm sorry, but I think that this is not going to work out. So Dan is like, well, okay, that's perfectly fine. Zoe also is to notice that Dan is really injured and really wounded. And Dan is to say, it's like, well, like the day before I was in some fender bender. And so, yeah, like I'm just kind of nursing my wounds from that. So Zoe then goes on to go into her house and is to start making herself a meal. This like just kind of TV dinner. So Dan goes on to try and start his car and get everything ready to go, and all of a sudden his car won't start. And so Dan walks over to Zoe's place and he's like, "You're not going to believe this." So Dan tries to get AAA to start his car, and in the meantime, Dan also goes on and prepares a meal for Zoe. And Zoe is thinking that Dan is like, "You're trying to butter me up somehow," and Dan is like, "No, no, no, no! Like, I just want to make a meal for you, because like I like saw what you were eating before, so I want to just try to make a meal. Like, just it's the right thing." And so while Dan and Zoe were to start talking to one another, uh, we of course have Zoe who ends up buttering up to Dan with this meal, and eventually they come to an agreement where if he pays 2 months rent ahead of time, that Zoe will let him keep the dogs. And so Dan is to be like, "Okay, great, like I can just kind of live here and like I won't go anywhere." So we all of a sudden have Dan, who is to hear a sound coming from Zoe's place, and so he heads over, and she, of course, is to break this glass. Dan goes over there, and come to find out, Zoe is to mention to Dan that she had gotten this phone call that her son is having problems at college because the tuition was short, and that he may not be able to go on and do certain classes. And the only reason for that is because Zoe's ex-husband was to have gone on and from time to time shorten the alimony checks, uh, just so that he can show Zoe like how much that he still does not like her. So it seems that Zoe is short some money. Dan is like, "Well, hey, like how about I just kind of go on and just kind of help you out? It's only money." And like it seems that Dan has a ton of it for a guy that's running away to trying to disappear here. So Zoe is like, "Well, that's nice and all, but no, I can't accept it. Like, we'll just have to figure something out." So Dan goes back to his place, and so Zoe then decides to go over to Dan's place and is to ask him like, "Hey, do you want to go out somewhere? Do you want to go and eat?" And Dan is like, "Is it my time to cook? Like what?" And Zoe's like, "No, let's just go out somewhere." And Dan's like, "Okay, this sure. Like I don't know, I did so well like talking to this woman that like she wants to like go out with me somewhere." So because there was an agreement that they were to go and 2 months rent ahead of time for the security deposit, and that Dan would come and uh, cook for her every like 3 days of the week. And so they go out and eat, and so they're exchanging medication basically, telling us which medication that they need. And so Dan is to mention how he had lost his wife to Huntington's disease or illness. I'm purposely not trying to butcher that. I just don't remember what thing it is. So since Dan is to easily talk about his wife, Zoe just feels awful how like she can't really talk about her relationship all that easy compared to Dan. And considering like Zoe just like left her husband. So Zoe then goes on and is to explain her relationship to her husband, or about her husband. So Zoe is to mention that she has two different versions of this story. So Zoe then goes on and tells this one story that eventually, both of them broke up. Uh, the husband was to find another woman and eventually leave them, and like that was kind of a very vague story. But then Zoe goes into a much more specific story where at some point Zoe had started to grow unhappy with her husband, but she was convinced to try to continue to make it work. And so her husband was to consistently go on and somehow or another continue to make sacrifices to stay with this family. But then all of a sudden, the husband was to go on and find a younger version of his wife. And so he then ran off with this woman. And so now, since their son is in college, really, Zoe doesn't have anyone to live with or anything like that. So Zoe used to go on and tell Dan the absolute truth, and it's like Dan's like, well, you know what, you can't help the way you feel, you're not a villain in this story. And Zoe's like, well, yeah, it may seem like that, but wouldn't you not go on and write yourself off as a villain? And Dan's like, well, yeah, that's probably true. So after this date, which technically isn't a date, it's just two people going to dinner, or maybe it's a date, I don't know. It seems like they maybe shared a bed together, so it seems to be accelerating the relationship a bit. So Emily goes on, or Emily, Zoe and Dan go on to drive home and come to find out there's a roadblock. And so Zoe's like, well, should I turn around? I've had a couple of things of wine, not quite sure if I'm going to get a DUI. And Dan's like, no, just keep driving, and maybe it has nothing to do with us. Maybe it's fine. So they continue to drive, and so Zoe is to give her license to these men, and so Dan is to have to get out of the car. Dan is trying to shift his look so he can look tweakingly different. Dan doesn't have his ID on him, but so we have Dan that is next to this police officer as Zoe is talking to this other police officer, and Dan is imagining in his brain that he's going to go on and stab into this one police officer with this knife, and he is to go on and grab the police officer's gun, shoot the other police officer, and then when Dan is to talk to Zoe, as Abby had talked to Dan in the previous episode, mentioning that I see you and I know who you really are, we have Zoe who is to go on and tell Dan the same thing. That, I don't know if I can go with you, Dan, because I see you. Dan goes on and shoots Zoe, and then is to, I'm assuming, go back in his vehicle and drive off because he knows that eventually this is going to attract a lot of attention. But then all of a sudden he realizes this is all just some dream that he is just thinking of. And the officer just turns to Dan and tells Dan, it's like, well, it seems like I smell some alcohol on Zoe's breath. So, sir, are you going to be able to drive today to get home? And Dan is like, well, yeah, I can drive. And so they're like, well, okay then. Just keep going about your day. So nothing is to be written off, whatever. Everything seems to be fine. So by the end of the episode, we find out different. So Zoe and Dan make their way back home, and so we're kind of thinking that the night is going to end there, but then all of a sudden Zoe is to grab onto Dan's hand, and they walk back into the house. So Dan, dreaming again, is seeing Abby and mentioning like how much she had to give up to be with Dan, and how she had to kind of forget who she was to be with Dan, and how she regretted it, this and that. So all of a sudden, come to find out, Dan is realizing this is another dream where Abby is trying to get after uh, possibly Dan's new love, temporary love. Who knows? So Dan is to wake up in a bed by himself back at his home. So it seems that maybe they didn't go on and sleep with one another, or maybe they didn't go and have a coffee together, or whatever. But so, come to find out, in this episode, Harold is to go off and do a number of things. So, Harold is to go on to meet with a guy named Morgan Boat. Morgan Boat is to go on and speak with Harold, and is to be, it seems, this painter. So Morgan is to almost talk like Harold and Dan were his two sons, and that Morgan was to find out that Dan was to leave the agency to become this Lawrence of Arabia, and that Harold was to leave the agency to become this cop, this FBI agent. So I'm assuming, like, before they were in the military, but then they left to go on and become these other people. So Morgan Boat is to be talking about the light, and how, like, he hopes that the light will just stay there, and so he can kind of finish this painting. And so Morgan is to go on and give Harold this number. And Harold is kind of leery about picking up this number because this number is to quite possibly be for a hitman. We also have Morgan, who was to have gotten a call from a woman who is to read off his obituary to find out how they thought about his death. So Morgan was to say, it's like, well, it wasn't about like the word she said, but just how she said it. Just like, just didn't really be a thing that he really enjoyed hearing. So Harold is possibly thinking how, if this doesn't turn out the way he wants it to, how maybe someone's going to come after him next. Someone's going to try to chop him off. So Harold ends up grabbing this number and taking it, and he ends up calling this guy. And so Harold is to ask this guy that he ends up calling, like, do you consider yourself to be good at what you do? Like, are you good? And the guy is like, well, like, if you're getting the phone number from me, for me, like, you shouldn't be asking that question. And Harold is like, well, no, I want the confirmation from you. Like, I want you to tell me that, like, you're good at what you do. And the guy is like, yeah, I'm good. So Harold is like, well, okay then, like, you're gonna go after this guy. So Harold is to also find out that Angela is to have this paperwork that is to say that Emily is to be dead. She is to have killed herself off. And I'm like, yeah, right. Like, this is a bunch of horse. Like, I have a feeling that this thing that is said to be about Emily is just so that way she could disappear. it's not really true. So Harold, or wouldn't it be interesting if there was some part of Dan that is losing his mind and Emily isn't a real person? But again, I'm possibly thinking that Emily is to be probably Angela Adams, and that's what I'm thinking. To just be so close to this, and it would be interesting if it really was that kind of case. So, with Angela, who is now with Raymond Waters, and he's trying to use Angela to go against Harold. Waters is to mention how Dan used to go on and used to work. That he had like this own boogeyman kind of name, and that he was, of course, to be an American who was to kill off Russians and so on and so forth. And so Angela is to hear this whole story, and she is telling Waters, "Is like, is this like from the agency that you work with, where they try to go on and try to have you like find somebody that you can kind of squeeze to work against, uh, like the person that you're going after?" Because Angela is not going to turn on Harold ever, and so like what this guy is trying to do is a waste. So, but then Angela is to go on and ask Harold a about this story that Waters was to mention, and Harold is just to try to finish up a very long story. And that's all he tells Angela. It's like, this is a very long story that I just want to wrap up. So Harold then walks away. So by the end of this episode, we, of course, Harold making a call to this would-be assassin, or this assassin that's probably going to go after Dan. And we have footage, of course, of Dan in this car, and we have Zoe's license. And so Harold is then go on and tell this guy information of where Dan is to be at. So, uh, so this assassin can go after Dan by the end of this episode. So, with that said, hopefully that goes on and covers most of this episode, because there was a lot to have probably said here. Other than that, I think I've covered most of this, so I think I feel okay about just calling this one what it is. Let me know in the comments below if there's something that I forgot about, because I'm sure that there probably is a million things that I did. Let me know how you felt about The Old Man, if you were surprised by this show, if you were to go on and like not like this show, you were thinking that it was something else, blah 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 blah. Let me know how you felt about The Old Man, because I think I'm going to go on and get out of here so I can go on and review something else for the day and then call it a day. So goodbye everybody.